Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Vincent Castellano, and I need to tell you what really happened in the Olympic National Forest in October 1973. The government said it was a seismic event. They lied. I was 29 then, working as a park ranger at Sol Duke Station, most remote outpost in the whole Olympic Peninsula. 8 years I'd been keeping watch over those ancient forests, and I thought I knew every sound, every shadow, every trick the wilderness could play on a man's mind. Maybe I should tell you about myself first. I came back from Vietnam in '65 with hands that shook when I tried to light a cigarette and dreams that wouldn't let me sleep. The Corps had trained me to blow things up, bridges, bunkers, anything that needed destroying. But over there I learned that some things, once you break them, you can't put them back together. The Park Service needed someone who knew explosives for avalanche control. I needed somewhere quiet to put my head back on straight. Seemed like a good match. Sol Duke Station sits 40 miles from the nearest town, connected by a single winding road that turns to mud when it rains. And in the Pacific Northwest, it always rains. The station's just a small wooden building with a radio tower, surrounded by Douglas firs so tall they seem to scrape the belly of the sky. My cabin was a quarter-mile away, tucked between two hills like God had cupped his hands around it. I liked the quiet. Liked being alone with my thoughts and a bottle of bourbon when the nightmares came. The Quinault tribe had stories about these woods, called them demons walking ground. But I figured that was just old superstition. After what I'd seen men do to each other in the war, I wasn't scared of ghost stories. That October started different. The animals were acting strange. Deer would stand in clearings and stare at me with wide, scared eyes. Birds flew in circles, crashing into trees like they'd forgotten how to navigate. Even the forest sounds were wrong. Too quiet during the day, too loud at night. The weather wasn't helping. Storm after storm rolled in from the Pacific, bringing winds that howled through the trees like wounded animals. Rain fell so hard it stung your face. Lightning split the sky every few minutes, turning the whole world white for a split second before plunging it back into darkness. On October 15th, the radio started picking up strange signals. Not words exactly, but sounds that made my teeth ache. Static mixed with something that sounded almost like voices, but in a language I'd never heard. I figured it was atmospheric interference from the storms. I should have paid attention to the warnings. The logging crew up at Hurricane Ridge had missed their check-in call. Tommy Brennan was the foreman. Good man, steady as a rock. He'd never missed a radio call in 3 years. When the second day passed without word, I knew something was wrong. The road to Hurricane Ridge was washed out, but I had a Jeep with chains and 8 years of experience driving through Pacific Northwest mud. I told myself I was just being careful, following protocol, but deep down something cold was growing in my stomach. The bourbon wasn't helping me sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that strange static from the radio, saw those scared deer standing in the rain. And something else, a feeling like being watched from the spaces between the trees. On the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I loaded my Jeep with emergency supplies, flares, and a few sticks of dynamite from the avalanche control kit. Standard procedure for clearing fallen trees. At least, that's what I told myself. The drive to Hurricane Ridge took 4 hours instead of the usual 90 minutes. Twice I had to stop and move trees that had fallen across the road. The forest felt different, darker somehow, even though it was the middle of the day. The trees seemed to lean in toward the road, their branches reaching like fingers. I found the logging camp just as the sun was setting. The work lights were still on, casting long shadows across the clearing. Equipment sat where it had been abandoned. Chainsaws, cables, the big diesel generator humming away. But no people. That's when I saw the first impossible thing. A chainsaw, still running, embedded in the trunk of a cedar tree 40 feet off the ground. The chain was spinning, throwing sawdust into the wind. but there was no way a man could have gotten it up there. I killed the engine and stepped out of the Jeep. The smell hit me first, like copper pennies and ozone, the way the air smells right before lightning strikes. Then I saw the footprints. They were huge, 22 inches long, maybe more, pressed into solid granite like the rock was soft clay. Whatever had made them had to weigh at least 800 pounds. But the shape was wrong. They looked almost human, but stretched out with long toes that ended in what might have been claws. I followed the prints to the equipment shed. The door had been ripped off its hinges, not unlocked, not broken, but torn completely away. Inside, half my dynamite supply was gone. The boxes looked like they'd been opened by someone who'd never seen a latch before, just ripped apart with brute force. That's when I found the recording device. Tommy Brennan was the kind of foreman who documented everything. He'd been taping their work conversations for safety reports. I found his recorder in the mud, still running. The tape was almost full. I rewound it and pressed play. For the first few minutes, it was just normal work sounds. Men talking, chainsaws running, the creak of falling timber. Then the voices got worried. Someone was saying they'd found tracks, big ones. The tape went silent for a long moment. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, so low it made my chest vibrate. And the recording device went crazy. Static and feedback, and underneath it all, that sound like the earth itself was screaming. Then nothing, just the hiss of empty tape. I stood there in the growing darkness, listening to the silence where 6 men should have been. The work lights cast dancing shadows that looked like people for a split second before revealing themselves as empty air. And somewhere in the distance, I heard something that might have been footsteps. Big ones, coming closer. I spent that first night in my Jeep with the engine running and the headlights on. Every shadow looked like it might be moving. Every sound could have been footsteps. The radio crackled with that weird static, and twice I thought I heard voices calling my name. When morning came, I drove back to Salduke Station to report what I'd found. But the phone lines were down, and the radio tower had been struck by lightning during the night. The metal was twisted into shapes that didn't make sense, like something had grabbed it and wrung it out like a wet towel. I was completely cut off. The smart thing would have been to hike out to the main road and flag down a car. But I kept thinking about those men, Tommy Brennan and his crew. If they were hurt, if they were trapped somewhere, I couldn't just leave them. I spent the day gathering supplies, more flares, rope, a first aid kit, and the rest of my dynamite. I also grabbed my service pistol, a .45 I'd carried in Vietnam. It felt small and useless in my hand, but it was better than nothing. The second trip to Hurricane Ridge was different. The forest was quieter, like it was holding its breath. No bird songs, no insect noise, just the sound of my Jeep's engine echoing off the trees. Even the wind had stopped. I found the first body near Cascade Creek. It was Jerry Muller, one of Tommy's guys. At least I think it was Jerry. He was hanging from a tree branch 30 feet up, his body twisted in ways that made my stomach turn. But what scared me most wasn't how he died. It was how he'd gotten up there. The tree had no branches. For the first 20 feet, no way to climb it. I called out, hoping maybe the others were hiding somewhere. "Tommy, it's Vince! If you can hear me, sound off!" My voice echoed strangely like the forest was swallowing the words. Something called back. "Vince? Vince, help me!" It was Tommy's voice coming from deeper in the woods. I followed the sound, crashing through underbrush, calling back to him. "Tommy, where are you? Keep talking." "I'm hurt, Vince. Something's got me trapped. Please help." The voice led me to a small clearing. I stopped at the edge, scanning the trees. "Tommy? I can't see you." "Down here, Vince. Down here." I looked down and saw the second impossible thing. Footprints. The same giant prints I'd seen before, but these were different. They were glowing with a soft blue light, like someone had filled them with foxfire. And they were warm. I could feel heat radiating from them even from 10 feet away. "Tommy," I called again. But this time, the voice that answered wasn't quite right. It was Tommy's voice, but stretched out, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Come closer, Vince. I need help." That's when I realized Tommy Brennan was dead. I'd seen his body on the way to the clearing, half buried under a fallen log. Whatever was calling to me with his voice, it wasn't human. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. But as I moved, I heard something else. Footsteps. Big ones. Following me. The thing, whatever it was learning. It had heard Tommy's voice, and now it was using it to hunt me. But it wasn't perfect. The timing was off, the words slightly wrong. Like someone trying to speak a language they'd only heard once. I made it back to my Jeep and drove away as fast as I could. But in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A shadow between the trees, too tall to be human, keeping pace with the G's, P without seeming to run. When I got back to Sol Duke Station, the radio was working again. I tried to call for help, but something was wrong with the signal. Instead of dispatch, I heard voices from the past. Missing person reports from 1962. Search and rescue calls from 1958. Like the radio was picking up echoes from old tragedies. One voice kept repeating, "Day 4 of the search for the Peterson family. Still no sign. Something's wrong in these woods. Something's very wrong." I turned off the radio and sat in the silence. Outside, the storm was building again. Lightning flickered in the distance, and I could hear the wind picking up. But underneath it all, I heard something else. A sound like breathing, but too deep, too slow to be human. I checked my .45 and counted my bullets. 15 rounds. I had a feeling I was going to need them. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the window with my gun in my lap, watching the tree line. The lightning was almost constant now, turning the forest into a strobe light show. And in the spaces between the flashes, I saw things moving. At 3 a.m., I heard scratching on my cabin door. Slow, deliberate scratches, like something was trying to write a message. I crept to the window and looked out. The door was covered in symbols carved deep into the wood. They looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. And they were still warm. I could see steam rising from them in the cold air. Then I heard Tommy's voice again, right outside my window. "Vince, let me in. I'm hurt bad." I looked out and saw a shadow standing in my yard. It was the right height to be Tommy, but the shape was wrong. Too wide at the shoulders, too long in the arms. And when the lightning flashed, I saw it didn't have a face. Just smooth skin where features should have been. "I know you're in there, Vince," it said in Tommy's voice. "I can smell all your fear." I sat in the dark until dawn, listening to it circle my cabin. Sometimes it sounded like Tommy, sometimes like Jerry. Once it spoke in my own voice, saying things I'd never said. When the sun came up, it was gone. But carved into the tree outside my window was a message in those strange symbols. And somehow, I could read it. "We know you're here." The next morning, I found backup. Ranger Mike Santos arrived from the main station in a Park Service truck responding to my missed check-ins. I'd never been so happy to see another human being. Mike was young, maybe 25, with that eager attitude that hadn't been ground down by years of dealing with people's worst camping decisions. "Vince, you look like hell," he said, climbing out of his truck. "When's the last time you slept?" I started to tell him about the logging crew, the voices, the impossible footprints. But how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone that the forest itself has gone crazy? "There's something wrong in these woods, Mike. Something dangerous. We need to get help." Mike nodded, but I could see he thought I was just overworked. "Why don't you show me what you found? We'll figure it out together." I didn't want to go back to Hurricane Ridge, but Mike was right. I needed a witness, someone else to see what I'd seen. Maybe then I could convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. We drove up in Mike's truck, me pointing out the places where I'd found the bodies. But when we got there, they were gone. No sign of Jerry Muller hanging from the tree. No trace of Tommy's remains under the log. Even the chainsaw embedded in the cedar had vanished. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" Mike asked, looking around the empty clearing. I was sure. But without evidence, I sounded like a man having a breakdown. "They were here. I swear they were here." Mike put his hand on my shoulder. "Look, Vince, you've been alone up here for too long. Sometimes the mind plays tricks." That's when we heard the scream. It came from the direction of Cascade Creek, high and sharp, and full of pain. Human pain. Mike and I looked at each other, and I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. "That came from the water," Mike said. "Someone's hurt." We ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The scream kept going, never stopping to breathe. No human throat could make that sound for that long. We found the source at the creek bank. There was nothing there, just water flowing over rocks, and that scream echoing off the canyon walls. But the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, like the air itself was in agony. Mike pulled out his radio. "Base, this is Santos. We've got a situation at Hurricane Ridge. Need backup and a medical team." The radio crackled to life, but the voice that answered wasn't dispatch. It was Mike's voice, speaking words he hadn't said yet. "Base, this is Santos. Never mind the backup. Everything's fine up here. Santos out." Mike stared at the radio. "I didn't say that." The scream stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something else. Footsteps. Big ones. Coming from upstream. "Mike, we need to leave. Now." But Mike was staring at something in the water. "Vince, look at this." The creek was running red. Not muddy red from sediment, but bright red like blood. And in the red water, I could see shapes moving, not fish. Something else. Something that looked almost like hands, reaching up from the bottom. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered. The water started to bubble. Steam rose from the surface, and I could smell something burning, like metal in a forge. The temperature around us dropped suddenly, maybe 40 degrees in a few seconds. I could see our breath in the air. That's when Mike started screaming. I turned to look at him, and what I saw made my knees weak. Mike was standing exactly where he'd been, but he was also hanging from a tree branch 20 feet, but above us. Both versions of him were screaming, the one on the ground clutching his head, the one in the tree with his spine bent at an impossible angle. "Which one is real?" I shouted, but my voice sounded strange, like it was coming from someone else's throat. The Mike on the ground grabbed my arm. "Vince, help me! Something's in my head." But when I looked at his face, his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the whole eye, like someone had poured tar into his skull. I ran. I left Mike there, both versions of him, and ran back to the truck. But when I got there, the keys were gone, and written in the dust on the windshield was a message in those same strange symbols. "You can't leave." Behind me, I heard Mike's voice calling, "Vince, don't leave me! It's got me!" I turned around and Mike was walking toward me. But something was wrong with the way he moved. His legs were too long, his arms hung at the wrong angle. And when he smiled, I saw too many teeth. "I'm fine now, Vince," he said in Mike's voice. "Everything's fine. Why don't you come back to the station with me?" I pulled out my .45 and pointed it at him. "Stay back." Mike, or whatever was wearing Mike's face, laughed. "Bullets won't help you, Vince. Nothing will help you now." I fired anyway. The bullet hit him center mass and he stumbled backward. But instead of falling, he started to change. His skin rippled like water, his face stretched and twisted. For a second, I saw something else underneath, something with yellow eyes and teeth like broken glass. Then he was Mike again, looking hurt and confused. "Vince, why did you shoot me?" I ran into the forest. Behind me, I heard Mike calling my name, but his voice was getting deeper, more distorted. And underneath it, I heard something else. Laughter, low and rumbling, like an avalanche made of sound. I ran until my lungs burned, crashing through trees and underbrush. When I finally stopped, I was lost. The forest looked the same in every direction. Tall trees, gray sky, shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to retrace my steps, but the ground kept changing. Paths that had been there moments before vanished. Clearings appeared where there had been solid forest. And everywhere I heard voices calling my name. Tommy's voice, Jerry's voice, Mike's voice, my own voice. "Vince, come back. We're all here. We're all waiting for you." The voices were coming from inside the trees. I could see faces in the bark, distorted, twisted, but recognizable. The missing loggers. Mike. And others. Older faces I didn't recognize. People who'd been lost in these woods over the years. I kept walking, trying to find my way back to the station. But the forest had become a maze. Every path led to the same clearing, where symbols were carved into the ground and the air shimmered with heat. At the center of the clearing stood a tree I'd never seen before. It was huge, maybe 8 feet in diameter, with bark that looked almost like skin. And hanging from its branches were clothes. Empty clothes, swaying in the wind like scarecrows. I recognized Mike's uniform, Tommy's flannel shirt, Jerry's work boots. As I watched, the clothes began to fill out. Arms appeared in the sleeves, legs in the pants. Faces formed in the shadows of the hoods, and all of them turned to look at me. "Welcome home, Vince," they said in unison. I ran again, but this time I knew the truth. I wasn't going to escape. Whatever lived in these woods, whatever had taken my friends, it was playing with me. Like a cat with a mouse, and it was getting stronger. I made it back to Solduke Station just as the blood moon was rising. I'd heard of lunar eclipses before, but I'd never seen one like this. The moon hung in the sky like a giant wound, casting everything in red light. The shadows were wrong. They moved independently of the objects that cast them, reaching toward me like grasping fingers. The station was exactly as I'd left it, but something felt different. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and there were symbols carved into every surface, the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They seemed to pulse with the same red light as the moon. I tried the radio one more time. Static answered me, but underneath it, I heard something else. A voice, speaking in a language that hurt to listen to. The words felt like ice picks in my brain. Then the static cleared and I heard a voice I recognized. My own voice, but older, more tired. "If you're hearing this, Vince, then you're about to meet the old one, the thing that's been sleeping under these mountains for 1,000 years. The blood moon wakes it up." I stared at the radio. "Who is this?" "I'm you, Vince. 10 years from now. This is what you need to know. It's not just a creature. It's older than the trees, older than the mountains. The Quinault called it the walker between worlds. It feeds on fear, on pain, on the space between life and death." The voice continued, fainter now. "You can't kill it, but you can stop it. There's a way, but the cost." The radio went dead. Outside, I heard footsteps. Not the heavy tread of boots, but something else. Something that sounded like bones clicking against stone. I looked out the window and saw it for the first time. It was 12 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light. Its arms hung down to its knees, ending in hands with fingers like tree branches. But it was the face that made my blood freeze. It was almost human, but stretched out, distorted. One eye was missing, replaced by a hollow socket that glowed with blue light. The other eye was yellow and ancient and full of hunger. Lightning scars covered its body, zigzagging across its chest like a road map of old pain. And when it moved, reality seemed to bend around it. The trees leaned away, the ground cracked under its feet, and the air itself seemed to scream. It looked directly at me through the window, and I felt something cold and alien brush against my thoughts. Images flooded my mind. Every death in Nian, these woods since the first human had walked here. I saw Native Americans fleeing in terror, loggers torn apart by invisible forces, hikers who'd simply vanished. Hundreds of years of fear and pain, all flowing into this creature like water into a sponge. And underneath it all, I felt its hunger. Not for food, but for something else. For the spark that makes us human. for the warm, bright thing that lives behind our eyes. It spoke, but not with its mouth. The words formed directly in my mind, each one like a nail being driven into my skull. Vincent Castellano, I have been waiting for you. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature's presence was like a weight pressing down on me, holding me in place. You carry the mark of war, the mark of death. You have fed me well over the years, little soldier. Every nightmare, every moment of terror, every drop of guilt, all of it has made me stronger. Images flashed through my mind. Vietnam, the things I'd done, the things I'd failed to do, the faces of the people I couldn't save. But now I need more. The blood moon comes only once in a generation. Tonight I can leave these woods. Tonight I can walk among your people and feast until I am full. The creature reached out with one massive hand and touched the window. The glass didn't break. It melted, running down the frame like water. Heat poured through the opening, bringing with it the smell of sulfur and decay. You have two choices, Vincent. Join me willingly, and I will make your death quick. Fight me, and I will show you pain that lasts forever. I looked around the station, searching for anything that might help. My eyes fell on the emergency kit, the one with the dynamite. Not much, just a few sticks. But it was something. Or, I said, backing toward the kit, I could blow this whole place to hell. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Explosives? You think to harm me with such crude tools? I am older than your species, little soldier. I have survived ice ages and meteor strikes. What makes you think your tiny bombs can hurt me? I grabbed the dynamite and started connecting the fuses. My hands were shaking, but 20 years of training took over. Maybe they can't hurt you, but they can hurt me. And if I'm dead, what are you going to feed on? The creature's expression changed. For the first time, I saw something like uncertainty in its ancient eyes. You would not. Your kind clings to life above all else. My kind, maybe. But I've been dead inside for 8 years. This would just make it official. I lit the fuse. The red sparks started racing toward the dynamite, and I could smell the sulfur. 30 seconds, maybe less. The creature roared, and the sound shattered every window in the station. It rushed toward me, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. But as it reached for me, something strange happened. The lightning scars on its body started to glow. Blue light poured from the wounds, and the creature stumbled, clutching its chest. For a moment it looked almost human, ancient and tired and in pain. You do not understand, it said, and this time its voice was different, sadder. I am not the enemy. I am the guardian. I keep the others from waking. If I die, they will come. Things that make me look like a gentle lamb. The fuse was almost gone. 10 seconds. Then why did you kill them? Why did you hunt me? Because I am starving. The old ways are gone, the old fears forgotten. I need the terror, the pain to stay strong, to stay awake. If I sleep, the real monsters will wake. 5 seconds. I looked at the creature, this ancient thing that had been guarding secrets I couldn't understand. And I made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I grabbed the dynamite and threw it out the window. The explosion lit up the night like a second sun. The blast wave knocked me across the room, and I felt something in my chest crack. But when the smoke cleared, the creature was still there, wounded, burned, but alive. It looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. You have shown mercy to a monster. Why? I sat up, tasting blood. Because I've been a monster too. And someone showed me mercy once. The creature nodded slowly. The blood moon passes. I will sleep again, and the others will remain in their dreams. But I will remember your kindness, Vincent Castellano, and when the time comes, I will try to return it. As the red light faded from the moon, the creature began to fade too. Its form became translucent, then transparent, then gone. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke one last time. Stay out of the deep woods, little soldier. Not all of us are as grateful as I. The official report said it was a seismic event, a small earthquake that triggered a landslide, burying the logging camp and causing several rockfalls. The missing men were listed as victims of natural disaster. Their bodies never recovered. I was found 3 days later by a search team suffering from a concussion and severe exposure. The doctors said I'd been talking in my sleep, but they couldn't understand the language. Later, I would learn it was an ancient Kino dialect that had been dead for over a century. My hair had turned completely white, not gray, white like snow. And my hands shook constantly now, not just when I was scared. The doctors said it was shock, but I knew better. Some things change you down to your bones. I tried to go back to work, but I couldn't concentrate. Every shadow might be hiding something. Every sound in the forest might be a footstep. The other rangers started avoiding me, and I couldn't blame them. I was jumpy, paranoid, talking to myself. The worst part was the memory loss. Whole chunks of time would just disappear. I'd be having a conversation with someone and suddenly realize I couldn't remember the last 10 minutes, or I'd find myself standing in my cabin with no memory of how I got there. The doctor said it was trauma, but I knew the truth. The creature had been inside my head, rifling through my memories like files in a cabinet. Some things had been damaged in the process. I kept a journal, trying to write down everything I could remember. But sometimes I'd find entries written in my handwriting that I couldn't remember writing. And they were always in that same ancient language, the one that hurt to think about. After 6 months, I couldn't take it anymore. I requested a transfer to a desk job in Seattle, but they suggested I take early retirement instead. For my health, they said. I didn't argue. I bought a small house in Port Angeles, close enough to the forest to keep an eye on things, but far enough away to feel safe. Most of the time, every month, I find something on my porch, a tuft of dark fur, a stone with symbols carved into it, a piece of bark that still radiates warmth. Reminders that I'm being watched, protected maybe, or just monitored. I've tried to research what I encountered, but most of the information is locked away in university archives or tribal records that outsiders aren't allowed to see. What I have learned is disturbing. The Kino have stories about the walker between worlds, but they also have stories about the things it keeps at bay. Things with names that I can't pronounce and don't want to learn. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the radio picking up those strange signals again. Voices speaking in dead languages, carrying messages I'm afraid to decode. And once, just once, I heard my own voice from that night at the station, warning someone else about the blood moon. Time isn't linear in those woods. Past, present, and future all exist at once, layered like sediment in a riverbed. The creature showed me that. And sometimes, I think I can still feel its presence in my dreams, ancient and patient and eternally hungry. I've become something of a local legend. The old ranger who warns hiker is away from the deep woods. They think I'm crazy, and maybe I am. But I've seen 3 people turn back because of my warnings, and I know at least one of them would have died if they'd kept going. The creature keeps its word. It protects those who listen to reason, but it has no patience for fools. Last week, a group of college students came through town, loaded down with camping gear and talking about finding Bigfoot. I tried to warn them, but they just laughed, called me a crazy old man living in the past. They went into the woods anyway. Hurricane Ridge, same area where I lost the logging crew. Only one came back. He was found 3 days later walking naked down Highway 101, talking to himself in a language that sounded like breaking glass. The doctors say he's catatonic, but I know better. He's seen something that broke his mind, and now he's trying to forget. The others are still missing. Officially, they're lost hikers who fell into a ravine or got turned around in the fog. But I know the truth. The creature is feeding again, drawing strength from their fear and pain, preparing for the next blood moon. I've been checking the lunar calendar. The next total eclipse visible from the Pacific Northwest is in 2017, 44 years from now. Will I still be alive to see it? Will I still be sane enough to warn people? I don't know. But I'll try. Because someone has to remember. Someone has to keep the warnings alive. And someone has to make sure that when the blood moon rises again, the walker between worlds doesn't wake up hungry. The deep woods are patient. They can wait. But so can I. And I'll be watching. My name is Catherine O'Malley, but everyone calls me Kit. I'm a ranger here in the Superior National Forest up in Minnesota. Been doing this job for 5 years now, and I love every minute of it. Well, most minutes anyway. I work out of the Ely Ranger District, which is about as far from civilization as you can get and still have a paycheck. My station covers the boundary waters between here and Canada. Thousands of acres of lakes and pine forests where a person can walk for days without seeing another soul. People always ask me why I became a ranger. Truth is, the woods have been my home since I was 12 years old. That's when my parents died in a car accident, and I went to live with the Nanebawekwa family on the reservation. Mary Nanebawekwa taught me to speak Anishinaabe, and her husband Joe taught me to track deer in fresh snow. They saved my life in more ways than one. Now it's January 1959, and we're having the worst winter anyone can remember. The temperature hit 47 below zero last week and hasn't come up much since. The snow is so deep you can't see the road signs, and the wind howls like something dying. I don't mind the cold. Never have. But this winter feels different. Wrong somehow. Even the animals sense it. I haven't seen a single deer track in 3 days, and the birds have gone completely silent. The forest feels like it's holding its breath. My radio crackled to life this morning while I was checking the ice thickness on Basswood Lake. "Kit, you there?" It was Jake Morrison from the main station. "I'm here, Jake. What's up?" "Got a call from the Johnson family. They're worried about old Thomas Kingbird. He was supposed to be back from his winter camp 2 days ago." I knew Thomas. He'd been one of my foster father's closest friends, and he used to tell me stories when I was little. Stories about the old days, about spirits in the forest, about things that hunt in the winter darkness. I always thought they were just tales to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. "Where's his camp?" I asked. "North end of Moose Lake. You know the spot." I did know it. Thomas had been using that same campsite for 40 years, ever since he was a young man. It was a good spot, sheltered from the wind, with access to fresh water and plenty of firewood. But it was also 15 miles from the nearest road, and in this weather, that might as well be on the moon. "I'll head out there," I said. "Probably just got snowed in." "Be careful, Kit. This weather's nothing to fool around with." I packed my gear and loaded up my snowshoes. The snow was coming down hard again, those big wet flakes that stick to everything. My thermometer read 32 below, which was actually warm for this week. I pulled on my heaviest parka and started north through the trees. The forest was beautiful in a deadly way. Every branch was heavy with snow, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. But something felt off. The snow under my feet was making strange sounds. Not the normal crunch, but something wet and hollow. And the wind kept changing direction, like it couldn't make up its mind which way to blow. It took me 3 hours to reach Thomas's camp. I could see the smoke from his fire long before I saw the cabin, which was a good sign. But as I got closer, I noticed the smoke was too thin, too scattered, like the fire had been out for a while. The cabin door was open. I called out, but no one answered. I could see tracks in the snow leading to the door, but they were old and mostly filled in. I pushed inside, and that's when I smelled it. Blood. Lots of it. Thomas was sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace. At first glance, he looked like he'd just dozed off waiting for the fire to catch, but when I got closer, I could see the truth. Someone had carved the meat from his bones with surgical precision. His arms, his legs, even parts of his face had been stripped away so cleanly, it looked like the work of a trained butcher. But the strangest part was his expression. He looked peaceful, happy even. I should have been sick. I should have been terrified. But all I felt was cold. Not the normal cold of a Minnesota winter, but something deeper, something that went right through my bones and into my soul. That's when I saw the teeth marks. They were on his ribs, clear as day. Human teeth, but wrong somehow. Too big, too sharp, and spaced too far apart, like they belonged to someone with a mouth twice the size of any normal person. I backed away from the body and bumped into the table. That's when I heard it. Laughter. It was coming from outside, carried on the wind. But it wasn't normal laughter. It was high and wild, like someone who'd lost their mind. And mixed in with it was something else. Sobbing. Like someone was laughing and crying at the same time. I grabbed my rifle and went to the window. The snow was falling harder now, and I could barely see 20 feet into the trees. But something was moving out there. Something tall and thin, walking between the pines like it owned the place. I blinked, and it was gone. I need to tell you about the stories Thomas used to tell me. When I was 13 and still learning to speak Anishinaabe, he would sit by the fire and talk about the old days, about the spirits that lived in the deep woods and the things that came out when people were hungry and desperate. The wendigo, he called it, a creature that was once human but had eaten the flesh of its own kind. The hunger changed them, made them into something else, something that could never be full no matter how much it ate. It's just a story, I used to tell him, a way to keep people from doing bad things during hard winters. Thomas would shake his head. Some stories are true, Kit, and some truths are too dangerous to forget. Standing in that cabin, looking at what was left of my old friend, I started to think maybe Thomas knew more than he was telling. I radioed back to the station, but all I got was static. The snow was interfering with the signal, and the batteries in my radio were dying faster than they should have been. Everything electrical seemed to be failing in the cold. I couldn't leave Thomas like that, but I couldn't carry him out either. Not in this weather, not 15 miles through the snow. So I did what I could. I wrapped him in a blanket and said a prayer in Anishinaabe the way Mary had taught me. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed something else. The fire in the fireplace wasn't just out. It was frozen. The ashes were covered in a thin layer of ice, like someone had poured cold water over them. But there was no water in the cabin, and no way for ice to form naturally in that spot. I stepped outside and immediately knew something was wrong. The snow around the cabin was disturbed, like a struggle had taken place. But the marks weren't from boots or snowshoes. They were long gouges in the snow, like something had been dragged, or like something with very long fingers had been digging. I followed the marks for about 50 yards into the trees. They led to a clearing where the snow was packed down hard, and there, in the center of the clearing, was something that made my blood run cold. Bones. Dozens of them, scattered around like someone had been having a picnic. But these weren't animal bones. They were human, picked clean and white as fresh snow, and they were arranged in a pattern like someone had been playing with them. I counted at least 3 different skeletons, maybe more. Some of the bones were old, weathered by years of winter. Others looked fresh, recent. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, rifle ready, but there was nothing there, just the wind in the trees and the sound of my oats when breathing. But I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I started back toward the cabin, moving fast but trying not to run. Running in deep snow is a good way to get yourself killed, and I had the feeling that whatever was out there was hoping I'd do something stupid. The footsteps followed me. Not close, but close enough. They were too light for a person in heavy boots, but too heavy for an animal. And they were coming from above, like something was walking on the tree branches. I made it back to the cabin and barricaded the door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the latch. Outside, the wind was picking up, and with it came that sound again. Laughter mixed with sobbing, like someone was having the worst day of their life and the best day all at once. I tried the radio again. Nothing but static and what sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Old voices, like they were coming from a long way away. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping fast. I could see my breath, and frost was forming on the windows. I needed to get a fire going, but every time I struck a match, the flame would flutter and die like something was blowing on it. That's when I saw the shadow on the wall. It was tall and thin, with arms that hung down to its knees, and it was moving, even though nothing in the cabin was casting it. The shadow seemed to be looking around, searching for something. Then it turned toward me. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. When I opened them, the shadow was gone. But something had changed. The cabin felt different, smaller, like the walls were closing in. I grabbed my pack and headed for the door. I couldn't stay there, not with Thomas's body and that thing circling outside. I had to get back to the station, had to tell someone what I'd found. But as I reached for the latch, the door swung open by itself. Standing in the doorway was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too big for his face. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something from 50 years ago, and they were covered in snow and ice. "Hello, Kit," he said, and his voice was like wind through dead leaves. "I've been waiting for you." I raised my rifle, but he didn't seem concerned. He just smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "You remember me, don't you?" he said. "Thomas told you about me, about what I am, about what I do." "You're not real," I said, but my voice came out as a whisper. "I'm as real as hunger," he said, "as real as the cold, as real as the need to survive when there's nothing left to eat." He stepped into the cabin, and the temperature dropped another 20 degrees. Frost formed on my rifle barrel, and the metal became so cold it burned my hands. "I knew your friend Thomas," the thing said. "He was delicious, full of stories and memories. I can taste them still." That's when I ran. I crashed through the back window of the cabin and rolled into the snow. I could hear the thing laughing behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran through the trees as fast as I could, branches tearing at my clothes and snow filling my boots. Behind me, the laughter grew louder and hungrier. I ran for what felt like hours, but probably wasn't more than 20 minutes. The snow was so deep I kept sinking up to my waist, and the cold was so intense it felt like knives in my lungs. But I kept going because I could hear that thing following me, not walking, running, moving through the trees like it weighed nothing, like the snow was just a minor inconvenience. And it was getting closer. I came to a frozen stream and decided to risk crossing it. The ice looked thick enough, and if I could get to the other side, maybe I could lose it in the thick pine forest beyond. I was halfway across when I heard the voice again. "Kit." It was right behind me now, so close I could feel its breath on my neck. "There's nowhere to run, girl. This is my forest. Now." I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just empty ice and falling snow, but I could smell it. Rotting meat and old blood, so strong it made my eyes water. I made it to the other side and dove into the trees. The forest was thicker here, and the snow wasn't as deep. I could move faster, but I was getting tired. My legs felt like lead, and my lungs burned with every breath. That's when I saw the camp. It was a small clearing with 2 tents and the remains of a fire. Ice fishing gear was scattered around, and I could see holes drilled in the nearby lake. But something was wrong. The tents were shredded, and the gear was covered in something dark that wasn't snow. I approached carefully, rifle ready. The first tent was empty, but the sleeping bag inside was torn to pieces. The second tent was worse, much worse. There were body parts inside, arms and legs and things I didn't want to think about, but no heads, no torsos, just pieces, arranged in neat piles like someone was organizing a butcher shop. I backed away from the tent and almost fell into one of the fishing holes. The ice around the edge was red with frozen blood, and when I looked down into the dark water, I could see shapes moving underneath, pale shapes that might have been fish but probably weren't. "They were so hungry," the voice said behind me. "A whole week without catching anything. Do you know what that does to a man's mind?" I turned around slowly. The thing was standing at the edge of the clearing, and now I could see it clearly. It had been human once, maybe, but not anymore. It was 15 feet tall and so thin it looked like a skeleton wrapped in yellowed skin. Its arms hung down to its knees, and its fingers ended in claws that were stained with old blood. But the worst part was its face. The cheeks were hollow, and the eyes were just empty sockets, and its mouth was full of teeth. Not human teeth, but long, sharp fangs that stuck out at odd angles. "They started fighting over the last can of beans," it said. and its voice was like wind through a graveyard. Then one of them got creative, started looking at his friend like he was a piece of meat. It smiled, and I could see bits of flesh stuck between its teeth. I just helped them along, it said. Gave them the courage to do what they really wanted to do, and when they were done, I had a nice meal waiting for me. I raised my rifle and fired. The bullet hit its center mass, but it just laughed. There was no blood, no wound. The creature just stood there like nothing had happened. You can't kill hunger, Kit, it said. You can't kill the cold. You can't kill the need. It started walking toward me, and with each step, the temperature dropped. The metal of my rifle became so cold it stuck to my hands, and the water in my eyes started to freeze. I dropped the gun and ran toward the lake. The ice was thick enough to support my weight, but I could hear it cracking under my feet. Behind me, the thing was laughing again, that awful sound that was half joy and half madness. I made it to the other side and kept running. The forest seemed to go on forever, and every tree looked the same. I was lost, and I was getting weaker. The cold was seeping into my bones, and I could feel my body starting to shut down. That's when I smelled smoke. There was a cabin ahead, hidden in a grove of birch trees. Light was coming from the windows, and I could see smoke rising from the chimney. I staggered toward it, hoping to find help, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. The door was unlocked. I pushed inside and found myself in a small, cozy room with a fire burning in the fireplace. An old woman was sitting in a rocking chair, knitting something that looked like a sweater. "Hello, dear," she said without looking up. "I've been expecting you." I collapsed into a chair by the fire. The warmth felt wonderful, but something was wrong. The old woman's knitting needles were moving, but I couldn't see any yarn, and her fingers were too long, too thin. "You're cold," she said, "and tired, and hungry. When did you last eat?" I tried to remember. It had been that morning, maybe. A few crackers and some coffee. My stomach was empty, and now that she mentioned it, I was starving. "I have some stew," she said. "Fresh meat, very tender." She got up and walked to the stove. I watched her ladle something into a bowl, and the smell made my mouth water. It was rich and savory, like the best beef stew I'd ever smelled. She handed me the bowl, and I took a big spoonful. It was delicious. The meat was so tender it fell apart in my mouth, and the broth was thick and warm. I ate hungrily, not caring about manners or conversation. "Good?" she asked. I nodded, taking another spoonful. "What kind of meat is this?" She smiled, and her teeth were too sharp. "Local game," she said. "Very fresh. Caught it just this morning." I was about to take another bite when I noticed something floating in the stew. It was round and white, about the size of a marble. I fished it out with my spoon and held it up to the light. It was a human tooth. I dropped the bowl and jumped up from the chair. The old woman was still smiling, but now her face was changing. Her skin was getting paler, and her eyes were sinking back into her skull. "Don't you like it?" she asked, and her voice was different now. Deeper, hungrier. I ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but something was holding it shut from the outside. I could hear scratching on the other side like claws on wood. "There's nowhere to go," the thing said behind me. It wasn't pretending to be an old woman anymore. "This is my forest, my hunting ground, and you're my prey." I turned around, and the creature was standing in the middle of the room. The cozy cabin was gone, replaced by a cave made of ice and bone. The fire was still burning, but now I could see what was feeding it, human bones, cracked and blackened. "I've been waiting for you, Kit," it said, "ever since you were a little girl listening to Tom Hayes' stories. I've been patient, I've been hungry, and now you're here." The walls of the cave were covered in drawings, pictures of people being hunted, being killed, being eaten. And in every picture, the hunter was the same tall, thin creature with the hollow eyes and the mouth full of teeth. "Do you know what I am?" it asked. I nodded, barely able to speak. "Wendigo." "Very good. And do you know what that means?" I shook my head. "It means I was human once. Just like you. I had a family, a home, a life. But one winter, when the snow was deep and the food was gone, I made a choice. I chose to survive, no matter what it cost. The creature moved closer, and I could see myself reflected in its empty eye sockets. "I ate my own family," it whispered. "My wife, my children. And with each bite, I became less human and more this. But I survived. I'm still here, 100 years later. Still hungry, still hunting." It reached out with one long, clawed hand and touched my face. Its fingers were like ice, and where they touched, my skin went numb. "I want you to make the same choice," it said. "I want you to understand what it means to be truly hungry, what it means to need something so badly you'll do anything to get it." The cave started to spin around me, and I felt myself falling. The last thing I saw was the creature's face, smiling that terrible smile. "Sleep now," it said, "and when you wake up, you'll understand." I woke up in complete darkness, and for a moment I thought I was dead. But dead people don't feel cold, and I was colder than I'd ever been in my life. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and I could feel ice crystals forming in my lungs. I was lying on what felt like solid rock, but when I reached out with my hands, I found it was ice, smooth, thick ice that stretched out in every direction. I sat up carefully and tried to get my bearings. I was in a cave. A huge cave made entirely of ice, with walls that curved up and disappeared into darkness above. The only light came from a strange blue glow that seemed to come from the ice itself, and the smell, God, the smell was terrible, like a slaughterhouse that had been closed for years. I got to my feet and started walking. My legs were shaky, and I realized I was incredibly hungry. My stomach felt like it was eating itself, and I could think of nothing but food. When was the last time I'd eaten? How long had I been unconscious? The cave seemed to go on forever. I passed chambers filled with bones, rooms where the walls were covered in claw marks, spaces where the ice was stained dark with old blood. And everywhere, scratched into the walls, were the same symbols over and over again. Pictures of people, and the tall, thin creature hunting them. I found my rifle lying on the ground in one of the chambers. The metal was so cold it burned my hands, but I picked it up anyway. It probably wouldn't do any good against the wendigo, but it made me feel better to have it. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from deeper in the cave, echoing off the ice walls. At first I thought it was just one voice, but as I got closer, I realized there were many. Men, women, children, all of them speaking at once, all of them saying the same thing. "Hungry, so hungry, please. Food, need food." I followed the voices until I came to a large chamber at the heart of the cave, and there, in the center of the room, was the wendigo. It was even more terrible than I remembered. 15 feet tall, with skin like old leather stretched over bones. Its arms hung down to its knees, and its fingers ended in claws that were stained with blood. But the worst part was its face. The cheeks were hollow, the eyes were just empty sockets, and its mouth was full of teeth. Too many teeth, all of them sharp and yellow. But it wasn't alone. Around it, sitting in a circle on the ice, were people, dozens of them, all in different stages of change. Some still looked mostly human, but with hollow cheeks and desperate eyes. Others were further along, their skin pale and tight, their fingers growing longer and sharper, and a few were almost completely transformed, thin and terrible and wrong. They were all staring at me. "Welcome, Kit," the wendigo said, and its voice was like wind through dead leaves. "Welcome to my family." I raised my rifle, but the creature just laughed. "You can't fight what you're becoming," it said. "You've been in my cave for 3 days. 3 days without food, without warmth, without hope. Can you feel it starting? The hunger?" I could. My stomach was cramping, and I could think of nothing but food. The people sitting around the wendigo were starting to look less like people and more like meat. "No," I said, but my voice came out as a whisper. "Oh yes," the wendigo said. "It's already begun. Soon you'll be like them." like me, and then you'll understand what it means to be truly free. One of the people in the circle started to move. He was a young man, maybe 20, but his eyes were wild and desperate. He crawled toward me on his hands and knees, and I could see that his fingernails had grown into claws. "Please," he said, "I'm so hungry. Just a little bit. Just a taste." I backed away, but there were others moving now. A woman with hollow cheeks and teeth that were too sharp. An old man whose skin had gone pale and tight. They were all crawling toward me, all begging for food. "This is what happens," the Wendigo said. "This is what I offer. Freedom from conscience. Freedom from morality. Freedom from everything that makes you weak." I thought about Thomas, sitting in his chair with the meat carved from his bones. I thought about the fisherman, torn apart and arranged like a butcher's display. I thought about all the people who had disappeared over the years, all the missing persons reports that had never been solved. "You did this," I said. "You made them like this." "I showed them the truth," the Wendigo said, "that when you're hungry enough, when you're desperate enough, you'll do anything to survive. Even eat your own kind." The people in the circle were getting closer. I could smell them now, that terrible smell of rot and decay, and I could feel something changing in me. The hunger was getting stronger, and they were starting to look less like people and more like food. "No," I said, and this time my voice was stronger. "I won't do it." "You will," the Wendigo said. "You have to. It's the only way to survive." I closed my eyes and thought about Mary and Joe Nachnabawekwa, the people who had raised me after my parents died. I thought about the stories they told me, about the spirits that protected the forest and the people who lived in it. And I thought about the song Mary had taught me, the one she said would protect me from evil spirits. I started to sing. It was an old song in Anishinaabe about the 4 directions and the spirits that guarded them. My voice was weak at first, but it got stronger as I sang. The Wendigo hissed and backed away, and the people in the circle stopped moving. "That won't work," the Wendigo said, but there was uncertainty in its voice now. "Old words, old magic. This is the modern world." I kept singing, and with each word I felt stronger. The hunger was still there, but it was fading. The people in the circle were looking at me with confused expressions, like they were waking up from a dream. "The hunger is stronger than your songs," the Wendigo said. "The cold is stronger than your hope." But I could see that it was wrong. The people in the circle were changing back, becoming more human. Their skin was getting warmer, their eyes were becoming clearer, and the Wendigo was getting smaller, less solid. "You can't destroy me," it said. "I am hunger itself. I am the cold. I am the need to survive." "Your fear," I said, still singing. "You're what happens when people give up hope." I reached into my pack and pulled out the emergency flowers I always carried. The Wendigo's eyes went wide as I lit one, and the red light filled the cave. The ice walls started to crack, and water began to drip from the ceiling. "No," the Wendigo said. "This is my home, my hunting ground." I threw the flare at the creature. It hit the ice wall behind it, and the whole cave shook. Cracks appeared in the ceiling, and huge chunks of ice started to fall. "Run!" I yelled to the people in the circle. "Get out of here!" They stumbled to their feet and ran for the entrance. I lit another flare and threw it at the Wendigo. This time it hit the creature directly, and it screamed. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, like all the pain and hunger and madness in the world rolled into one terrible cry. The ceiling was coming down now. I lit my last flare and threw it at the largest crack I could see. The whole cave shuddered, and I knew I had seconds before the whole thing collapsed. I ran for the entrance, dodging falling ice and jumping over cracks that opened in the floor. Behind me, the Wendigo was still screaming, but the sound was getting fainter. I could hear the ice crashing down, tons of it, burying the creature and its terrible hunger. I made it to the entrance just as the cave collapsed. The sound was like thunder, and the ground shook so hard I fell to my knees. When it was over, there was nothing left but a pile of broken ice and rock. I was alone in the forest, and for the first time in days I felt warm. I made it back to the ranger station 2 days later. The rescue team found me walking down the ice road, half frozen and talking to myself. They said I was lucky to be alive, that anyone else would have died out there in that cold. I told them about Thomas, about the fishing camp, about the people I'd found in the cave. They sent teams out to investigate, but they never found anything. The ice cave was gone, buried, and under tons of rock and snow. The fishing camp was empty, just shredded tents and some old gear. And Thomas, they found his body exactly where I'd left it. But the coroner said he'd died of exposure. Natural causes. Nobody believed my story. How could they? A monster that eats people and makes them into monsters too. Old songs that have power over evil spirits. It sounds crazy even to me sometimes. But I know what I saw. I know what happened out there in the deep woods. And I know it's not over. The wendigo is gone, but the hunger remains. I can feel it sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my cabin. A gnawing emptiness that no amount of food can fill. I've stopped eating meat entirely, and even then I have to force myself to eat it all. My body doesn't seem to need as much food as it used to, like something fundamental changed while I was in that cave. I've been having dreams too. Dreams about the forest, about the people who disappeared over the years. In my dreams, I can see them wandering through the trees, still hungry, still looking for something to fill the emptiness inside them. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I wonder if I'm going to become like them. I quit my job as a ranger 6 months later. Couldn't stand being out in the woods anymore. Couldn't stand the silence and the watching trees. I moved to town and became a clerk at the general store, but that didn't last either. Everywhere I went, I could feel eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. Finally, I went back to the reservation. Mary and Joe were getting old, and they needed someone to help them. But more than that, I needed to understand what had happened to me. I needed to learn the old ways, the songs and stories that had saved my life. Mary taught me about the spirits that live in the forest, about the balance between good and evil, about the power of words and songs and old knowledge. She told me that the wendigo was just one of many things that hunt in the darkness, and that there are people whose job it is to watch for them. You've been chosen, she said, marked, when the spirits saved you for a reason. I became a traditional healer, combining my knowledge of the forest with the old medicine ways. People come to me when they're sick, when they're troubled, when they've seen things that don't make sense, and sometimes, when the winters are hard and the snow is deep, they come to me with stories about tall, thin figures moving through the trees. That's when I know it's time to go back to the forest, not as a ranger, but as something else. A guardian, a keeper of old knowledge. Someone who remembers what lurks in the deep woods when people are hungry and desperate and alone. I found my own teeth in a tree last month. 3 of them, embedded in the bark of an old pine near Thomas's cabin. I pulled them out and threw them in the fire, but they wouldn't burn. They just sat there in the flames, white and hard, and somehow still connected to me. I never lost any teeth. My mouth is fine. All my teeth are where they should be. But somehow, part of me is still out there in the forest. Part of me is still hungry. The wendigo is gone, but the hunger remains. And it's spreading. I've been getting reports from other states, other forests. Rangers and hunters and campers who've seen things they can't explain. Tall, thin figures. Missing people. Bones arranged in patterns. It's starting again. The hunger is waking up, and it's looking for new places to feed. New people to change. I'm 63 years old now, and I'm tired, but I'm also ready. I know what's coming, and I know what I have to do. The old songs are still strong. The old knowledge is still true. And as long as there are people like me to remember, to watch, to stand guard, the darkness can be held back. But it can never be destroyed. The hunger is part of us, part of what makes us human. And in the deepest, coldest part of winter, when the snow is deep and the food is scarce, it will. I'll always be there, waiting, watching, hoping we'll make the same choice it did all those years ago. The choice to survive, no matter what it costs. Never venture alone into the boundary waters during the starvation months. That's what I tell people now. And if you find yourself lost and cold and hungry, remember this. The hunger is not your friend. It's not trying to save you, it's trying to make you into something else, something that's always hungry, something that's never satisfied, something that hunts in the darkness and feeds on the flesh of its own kind. The wendigo is gone, but the hunger remains. And it's still out there, waiting for the next person to make the wrong choice. My name is Marcus Thompson, but everyone calls me Mark. I'm a park ranger at Manistee National Forest in Michigan, and I need to tell you what happened to me back in October of 1987. People think I'm crazy when I tell this story, but I swear on my kids' lives that every word is true. I was 34 then, been working the forest for 11 years. Before that, I was a cop in Detroit with the K-9 unit. Had a German shepherd named Rex who was my partner for 3 years until some punk shot him during a drug bust. That's when I packed up and moved north. Couldn't handle the city anymore, not without Rex. The Manistee covers over 540,000 acres, and we rangers are spread thin, real thin. My district runs from the Pere Marquette River all the way to the Nordhaus Dunes. It's beautiful country, mixed hardwood and pine, sandy soil that holds tracks real well. During hunting season, I spend most of my time checking licenses and making sure hunters follow the rules. I had 2 dogs then, Duke and Ranger, both German shepherds. Smart as whips and loyal as the day is long. They lived with me in the little cabin near the ranger station. My ex-wife Linda had custody of our 2 kids, Tommy and Sarah, so the dogs were pretty much my family during the week. Weekends, when I had the kids, those dogs turned into gentle giants, letting Tommy and Sarah climb all over them. October 1987 was weird from the start. The weather was all wrong. Way too warm for Michigan in fall. Heavy fog kept rolling in off Lake Michigan, thick as soup. During hunting season, a lot of the back roads get closed to regular traffic, so it's just us rangers and the hunters out there. Radio communication gets spotty in the best of times. But with that fog, it was like being cut off from the world. The local Potawatomi had stories about these woods. Old Joe Crow Feather, who ran the bait shop in town, used to tell tales of out bear wolves, creatures that hunted in packs like wolves but stood tall like bears. He said they were smart, smarter than regular animals, and they could work together like soldiers. I always figured it was just old folklore, the kind of stories people tell around campfires. But looking back, maybe I should have listened closer. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. I was doing my regular patrol when I found a hunting camp that had been disturbed. 3 tents, all empty. But the strangest thing was how the sleeping bags were arranged. They were laid out in a perfect circle, all the zippers lined up, pointing toward the center. The hunter's gear was stacked in neat piles. Rifles, ammunition, even their boots, all organized like someone was taking inventory. Duke and Ranger were with me, and they both started whining the moment we got close to that camp. Duke's hackles were up, and Ranger kept looking over his shoulder like something was following us. These were tough dogs, trained for search and rescue, but they were acting like scared puppies. I called out for the hunters, thinking maybe they'd gone for water or to scout deer. No answer. I checked the camp registration. They were supposed to be there for 5 days, but all their food was still unopened, and the fire pit was cold. It looked like they'd never even stayed the night. That's when I found the first tracks. They started out normal enough, regular boot prints leading away from the camp. But about 20 yards into the woods, they got strange. The prints were deeper, like whatever made them had gotten heavier. Then, maybe 50 yards out, I found paw prints. Big ones, bigger than any dog or wolf I'd ever seen. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The boot prints and the paw prints were mixed together. Not like a person was walking with an animal. They were in the same E-line, like something had been changing as it walked. Duke and Ranger refused to follow the trail. I mean, flat out refused. These dogs would normally track a scent for miles, but they just sat down and wouldn't budge. Duke even started backing away, pulling on his leash to get us out of there. I should have listened to them. The call came in Thursday morning. Dispatch said they'd lost contact with a bow hunting club, 7 guys who'd gone out Wednesday for their annual trip. They were supposed to check in every evening, but nothing. Their families were worried sick. I knew exactly where they'd gone. There's a section of woods about 10 miles from the first camp with the best deer blinds in the forest. Elevated stands built into old oak trees, perfect for bow hunting. The area was popular because it was isolated. No roads, no other hunters, just pure wilderness. I took Duke and Ranger and hiked out there. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. It was like walking through a cloud that had fallen to earth. Everything was muffled. Even our footsteps sounded distant and strange. We found the first blind empty. The ladder was still down, but the hunter's gear was gone, not stolen, organized. His bow was hanging on a tree branch like a decoration. His arrows were stuck in the ground in a straight line, points all facing the same direction. The second blind was the same story. Empty, but with the hunter's stuff arranged in weird patterns. This time, his camouflage jacket was spread out on the ground like a blanket, and his hunting knife was driven into a tree at exactly eye level. That's when Duke started growling. It was a low, continuous sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. Ranger joined in, both dogs staring into the fog like they could see something I couldn't. I pulled out my flashlight and swept it back and forth, but the beam just bounced off the fog and came back at me. Then I heard it. It started as a howl, but not like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was too controlled, too purposeful. It rose and fell in a pattern that most sounded like a song. Then another howl answered from a different direction. Then another. But the worst part? They sounded like they were getting closer. I called out, thinking maybe it was the hunters playing some kind of joke. "Hello, this is Ranger Thompson. If you can hear me, call out." The howling stopped. Complete silence except for my own breathing and the dogs panting. Then, from somewhere in the fog, I heard what sounded like a human voice making a wolf howl, not howling words, but making the sound with a human throat. That's when I found the third blind. The hunter was there, but he wasn't hunting anymore. He was arranged at the base of his tree, sitting upright with his back against the trunk. His throat was torn open, but there was hardly any blood on the ground. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, and his mouth was formed into a perfect circle, like he'd been trying to howl. His bow was in his hands, but the string was snapped. Not cut, snapped, like something had grabbed it and pulled until it broke. The arrows were gone except for one, which was stuck in the tree about 8 feet up. No human could have put it there without a ladder. Duke and Ranger were going crazy now, pulling on their leashes and whining. I was reaching for my radio when I heard footsteps. Not human footsteps. Something heavier, moving through the underbrush with purpose. I spun around, flashlight in one hand, radio in the other. The beam caught something moving between the trees. Something big. Something that seemed to be walking on 2 legs, but moving like an animal. "Stop right there," I shouted. "Forest Service!" The movement stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of branches breaking way up high, like something was climbing, fast. I looked up and saw a shape moving through the treetops. It were as jumping from branch to branch like a squirrel, but it was huge. Too big to be doing what it was doing. The branches should have been breaking under its weight, but they were just swaying, like it weighed nothing at all. Then it was gone. I grabbed my radio and called for backup. The response was static, mixed with something that sounded like nature documentary audio, a narrator talking about wolfpack hunting behavior. I tried again, got the same thing. It was like my radio was picking up some TV show instead of dispatch. That's when I realized Duke and Ranger had gone completely quiet. They were staring at something behind me, their ears flat against their heads and their tails tucked between their legs. I turned around slowly. There were eyes in the fog, yellow eyes, reflecting my flashlight beam. Too high off the ground to be a regular wolf. Too wide apart to be human. And there weren't just 2. There were at least 6 pairs, arranged in a loose circle around us. One of them stepped forward, and I got my first clear look at what was hunting in my forest. It was like someone had taken a wolf and stretched it upright. Still had 4 legs, but it was standing on its hind legs like a person. Its front legs were longer than they should be, ending in hands that were almost human, but with claws instead of fingernails. Its head was wolf-shaped, but bigger, with a mouth full of teeth that looked like they'd been designed for tearing. But the worst part was its eyes. They weren't animal eyes, they were intelligent, calculating, looking at me like it was trying to decide whether I was worth the effort. It tilted its head and made a sound that was half growl, half chuckle. Then it dropped to all 4s and melted back into the fog like it had never been there. Duke and Ranger were shaking. These were tough dogs, trained for dangerous work, but they were terrified. I was pretty terrified myself. We got out of there fast, real fast. But as we were leaving, I heard that howling again. This time it was coming from all around us, like we were surrounded. And underneath, at the howling, I could swear I heard something else. Something that sounded almost like laughter. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow eyes staring at me from the fog. Duke and Ranger wouldn't leave my side, and they kept pacing to the windows like they were expecting something to come through. Friday morning, I called in sick and drove to town. I needed to talk to someone who might understand what I'd seen. Old Joe Crow Feather was behind the counter at his bait shop, repairing a fishing net. "Joe," I said, "tell me about those bear wolf stories." He looked up at me with sharp old eyes. "You saw them." It wasn't a question. He just knew. "Tell me what they are." Joe set down his net and walked to the window. He stared out at the forest for a long moment. "My grandfather called them the Pack. Said they were people once, long time ago. Warriors who got lost in the woods during a bad winter. When they came back, they weren't people anymore. They were something else." "What do they want?" "To hunt. It's all they know now. They hunt in groups, like wolves, but they think like people. They can plan. They can wait. They can work together in ways that regular animals can't." I told him about the arranged gear, the organized crime scenes. He nodded like he'd heard it all before. "They're marking territory," he said, "claiming the forest. And they're smart enough to know that if they leave bodies lying around, people will come looking. So they clean up, they organize, they make it look like something else." "How do I stop them?" Joe turned back to me. "You don't. You stay out of their territory and hope they leave you alone. Or you leave and let someone else deal with it." But I couldn't leave. This was my forest, my responsibility. And there were still 4 missing hunters out there, maybe still alive. That afternoon I went back. This time I brought my service weapon and extra ammunition. Duke and Ranger didn't want to go, but I needed their noses. If those hunters were still alive, the dogs might be able to track them. The fog was even thicker than before. I could barely see my own feet. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Ranger suddenly stopped and started digging in the sandy soil. He uncovered something that made my stomach turn. It was a human hand, still wearing a wedding ring. But it had been buried deliberately, carefully, like someone was saving it for later. I was calling it in when I heard engines. Vehicles coming through the forest, which was strange because the access road was supposed to be closed. I headed toward the sound and found 2 state police cars parked in a small clearing. The officers were already out of their vehicles, but they weren't moving. They were just standing there, perfectly still, staring into the forest. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. As I got closer, I realized why. They weren't breathing. Both officers were dead, but they'd been positioned to look like they were on patrol. Their weapons were missing, but their holsters were still snapped shut. Their radio equipment was gone, but their radios were still clipped to their belts. And their service weapons. Their service weapons were arranged in a neat pile about 20 feet away, like toys that had been put away after playtime. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from the radio in one of the police cars. But they weren't dispatch voices. They were the voices of the missing hunters, calling for help, screaming for help, begging for help. I grabbed the radio microphone. "This is Ranger Thompson. Where are you? Give me your location." The screaming stopped. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. One of the hunter's voices, but calm now, almost cheerful. "We're right here, Ranger Thompson. We're waiting for you." I looked around. Duke and Ranger were backing away from the police cars, whining. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, like it was being drawn toward us. Then I saw them. They were standing just at the edge of visibility, maybe 6 of them, but they weren't the wolf things I'd seen before. These looked almost human. Almost. They were tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the missing hunter's clothes. But their faces were wrong. Too long, too angular, with teeth that didn't fit properly in their mouths. One of them spoke in a hunter's voice. "We've been waiting for you, Mark. We have something to show you." They started walking toward me, and as they moved, they began to change. Their faces stretched and elongated. Their hands grew claws. Their backs hunched forward. By the time they'd taken 5 steps, they weren't human anymore. I pulled my weapon and fired. The bullet hit the lead creature's center mass, and it stumbled, but didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the wound, then back at me, and made that sound again, half growl, half chuckle. Duke and Ranger were going crazy, barking and snarling, but they wouldn't attack. They were too scared. Or maybe they were too smart. I fired again and again. The creatures scattered, but I could tell they weren't really hurt. They were just playing with me, like cats playing with a mouse. That's when I realized what was happening. They weren't trying to kill me. They were hurting me. Every time I moved in one direction, one of them would appear and force me to go another way. They were driving me somewhere specific. I tried to run, but they were faster. I tried to hide, but they could smell me. And no matter which way I went, they were always there, just out of sight, guiding me deeper into the forest. Finally, I found myself in a small clearing I'd never seen before. There was an old cabin in the center, abandoned and rotting. But the strangest thing was the smell. It was like a zoo, but wrong, like too many animals had been living too close together for too long. Creatures emerged from the tree line and surrounded the clearing. 7 of them now, all different sizes and shapes. Some looked more human, some more wolf, but they all had those same intelligent, calculating eyes. The largest one stepped forward. It was easily 8 feet tall, with a wolf's head on a human body. When it spoke, its voice was a mixture of all the missing hunters' voices, like a chorus of the dead. "Welcome to our home, Ranger Thompson. We've been preparing for you." The cabin door opened, and the missing hunters walked out. Except they weren't missing anymore, and they weren't really hunters. They moved wrong, like they were learning how to walk. Their eyes were yellow now, like the creatures, and their teeth were too sharp. But I could still recognize them. Jim Morrison, the insurance salesman from Grand Rapids, Pete Kowalski, the mechanic from Kalamazoo, the others whose names I'd memorized from the missing persons reports. "They're still alive," the large creature said. "But they're ours now. The pack grows." That's when I understood. These things weren't just killing people. They were changing them, converting them, building their numbers. "It's not possible," I whispered. "Your dogs understand," the creature said. "Look at them." Duke and Ranger were no longer cowering. They were standing at attention, their ears perked up, their tails wagging slightly. They were looking at the creature like they were waiting for orders. "No," I said. "No, they're my dogs. They're loyal to me." The creature made a sound like laughter. "Loyalty is just pack behavior, and we are the alpha now." Duke took a step toward the creature, then another. Ranger followed. "Duke, Ranger, come here!" They glanced at me, but they didn't obey. They kept walking toward the creature, their heads lowered in submission. I was losing everything. My forest, my backup, my dogs. The only family I had left was choosing these monsters over me. That's when I remembered something from my canine training. Dogs are pack animals. But they're also creatures of habit. They respond onto certain sounds, certain frequencies, almost automatically. I pulled out my emergency radio and found the frequency for the emergency broadcast system. Most people don't know this, but the EBS uses a specific high-frequency tone that can be heard for miles. It's designed to cut through interference and grab attention. I cranked the volume all the way up and held down the emergency button. The sound that came out was like 1,000 tea kettles whistling at once. It was so loud and so high-pitched that it hurt my ears, but it had an immediate effect on the creatures. They all stopped moving. The large one shook its head like it was trying to clear water from its ears. The converted hunters stumbled and fell to their knees. Most importantly, Duke and Ranger snapped out of whatever trance they'd been in. They looked confused for a moment, then ran back to me, whining and pawing at my legs. "That's right, boys," I said. "You know who you belong to." The creatures were recovering from the sound, but I could see it had disrupted whatever hold they had on each other. They were moving independently now, not as a coordinated pack. I had maybe 30 seconds before they regrouped. I grabbed Duke and Ranger and ran, not toward the forest, but toward the cabin. If these things had been using it as a base, maybe there was another way out. The inside of the cabin was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were covered with trophies, not animal trophies, but human ones. Clothing, jewelry, personal effects, all arranged in neat displays. There were photographs, too, pictures of families and friends, all organized by date. But in the back of the cabin, I found what I was looking for. A root cellar with a tunnel that led back toward the main forest road. It was narrow and dark, but it was a way out. I could hear the creatures regrouping outside. They were howling again, but this time it sounded angry, frustrated. They'd lost their prey, and they weren't happy about it. We crawled through that tunnel for what felt like hours. Duke and Ranger were good about staying. Quiet, but I could tell they were as scared as I was. Every sound from above made us freeze and listen. Finally, we emerged near the main road. My truck was parked about a mile away, but it might as well have been on the moon. The creatures would be looking for us, and they knew this forest better than I did. But we made it. Somehow, we made it. I drove straight to the state police barracks and told them everything. They looked at me like I was crazy, but they couldn't ignore the missing officers and the missing hunters. They organized a search party for the next morning, but when they got to the cabin, it was empty. No creatures, no converted hunters, no trophies. Just an old, abandoned building that looked like it had been empty for years. The only thing they found was a pile of police equipment and hunting gear, neatly arranged in the center of the cabin floor. That was 3 months ago. I've been on medical leave ever since, seeing a psychiatrist twice a week. The official report says I had a stress-induced breakdown brought on by isolation and the pressure of finding the missing hunters. The deaths were attributed to a rabid wolf pack that migrated down from Canada. But I know what really happened, and so do Duke and Ranger. Except Duke and Ranger aren't the same dogs anymore. They won't go near the forest. They won't even go in the backyard if it's dark. During the day, they're fine. Playful, loving, everything they used to be. But at night, they pace the house and whine. Sometimes I catch them staring out the windows like they're watching for something. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them making sounds that don't sound like any dog I've ever known. Sounds that are almost like howling, but with a human quality to them. I've applied for a transfer to a city park, somewhere with lots of people and streetlights and no wilderness for miles. The paperwork should go through next month, and I can't wait to get out of here. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The creatures are still out there, and they're still growing their pack. Last week I got a call from a ranger down in the Huron National Forest. He said they'd found a hunting camp with all the gear arranged in neat piles. The hunters were missing, but there were strange tracks leading away from the camp. Tracks that started out human and became something else. The week before that, it was a ranger in Wisconsin. Same story. Missing people, organized crime scenes, and tracks that didn't make sense. I think the pack is spreading, moving from forest to forest, claiming territory and converting anyone they find. And I think they're communicating with each other somehow, sharing information and coordinating their expansion. The worst part? I think they remember me. 2 nights ago, I found paw prints in my backyard, big ones. They led from the forest edge right up to my back door, then disappeared. But they left something behind. One of my old ranger badges, the one I'd lost during the encounter at the cabin. It was placed carefully on my doorstep, like a calling card, like a message. We know where you are. I don't know how long I have before they come for me. Maybe they're waiting for the right moment. Maybe they want me to suffer first. Or maybe they're just letting me know that no matter where I go, they'll find me eventually. If you're reading this and you work in the Forest Service, or you're a hunter, or you just like to spend time in the woods, remember this: trust your dogs. If your dog won't go somewhere, neither should you. Animals know things we don't. They can sense things we can't. And if you ever find a campsite with all the gear arranged in neat piles, don't investigate. Don't try to help. Just leave. Leave and don't look back. The pack is out there. They're growing, and they're smarter than we are. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I used to be a park ranger. Now I'm just a man trying to stay alive long enough to warn others. Trust your dogs. When they won't go forward, neither should you. The pack is hunting, and they're very, very patient. My name is Joseph Whitehawk, and I've been a ranger in the Chippewa National Forest for 14 years. That's long enough to know that the woods can play tricks on you, especially during wild rice season when the old stories feel closer to the surface. I'm half Ojibwe on my mother's side, half Irish on my father's, which means I've always been caught between two worlds. My grandfather used to say that made me twice as strong, but some days it just felt like being twice as lost. He taught me the old ways before he died: how to read the forest, how to respect the spirits, how to tell the difference between natural sounds and something else entirely. September 1981 was different from the start. We were in the middle of the worst heat wave I'd ever seen, with temperatures hitting 90 degrees when they should have been in the 60s. The drought had lasted 3 months, and the wild rice beds around Leech Lake were suffering. Lightning struck almost every night, but no rain ever came. I managed the Leech Lake District, all 661,400 acres of it. Most of the time I worked alone, which suited me fine. I knew every trail, every hidden lake, every burial mound that dotted the landscape like sleeping giants. The old burial grounds were sacred, especially during rice season, and I made sure they stayed protected. That morning I was checking on the harvest camps when I found the first one. Eddie Kingbird and his family had been working the rice beds for a week, following traditions that went back hundreds of years. Their camp was still there, the fire still smoldering, breakfast half-eaten on wooden plates, canoes pulled up on shore like they'd just stepped away for a moment. But the people were gone. I called out, my voice echoing across the still water. No answer. I checked the canoes, the sleeping area, even walked the shoreline looking for tracks. Nothing. A whole famps. Illy doesn't just vanish in the middle of breakfast. That's when I heard it. A sound like wind through hollow bones, musical and wrong. It came from the direction of the old burial mounds, those ancient hills where warriors had been laid to rest centuries ago. My grandfather always said the baycock lived there, the flying skeletons that hunted those who disturbed the dead. I'd always figured the baycock were just stories, warnings to keep people away from sacred places. But standing there in that empty camp, with that bone music drifting across the water, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The certainty that something was watching me. The compass on my belt started spinning slowly, the needle swinging in lazy circles before settling to point directly at the burial mounds. I tapped it, shook it, but it kept pointing the same way. Equipment malfunction, I told myself. Had to be. But deep down, I knew better. The old stories were waking up, and I was about to learn why my grandfather had always told them with such serious eyes. The next morning brought more empty camps. 3 families this time, all along the same stretch of water. Same story. Everything left behind. No signs of struggle. No tracks leading away. Just that hollow bone music echoing from the burial grounds. I radioed headquarters, but the static was so bad I could barely make out the dispatcher's voice. Instead, I kept hearing something else underneath. Drumming. like the old warrior ceremonies my grandfather had described, drums that had been silent for 200 years. I decided to investigate the burial mounds myself. The area was off limits to everyone except tribal members during rice season, and even then, most people stayed away. The mounds rose from the forest floor like sleeping animals, covered in ancient oaks and carpeted with fallen leaves that never seemed to rot. As I approached the first mound, the air grew cold despite the heat wave. My breath came out in small puffs of vapor. The shadows moved wrong too, shifting independently of the sun's position. I'd been in these woods for years, but suddenly they felt foreign, hostile. That's when I saw the feathers. Eagle feathers, pure white and perfect, were embedded in the solid granite of the mound's base. Not stuck on the surface, actually embedded in the rock like they'd been pressed into soft clay. I reached out to touch one, and my hand passed right through it like it was made of mist. The bone flute music grew louder, and I recognized the melody. It was my grandfather's death song, the one he'd taught me when I was 7 years old. The one he'd hummed on his deathbed 3 years ago. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The music was coming from inside the mound, but that was impossible. The burial chambers had been sealed for centuries. A shadow passed overhead, too large to be any bird. I looked up and saw something that made my blood freeze. A figure was flying between the trees, skeletal and wrong, with wings that weren't quite eagle and weren't quite human. It moved with unnatural grace like it was swimming through the air. The Baycock. It had to be. But Baycock weren't real. They were just stories, warnings about respecting the dead. The figure circled once, and I caught a glimpse of burning eye sockets in a skull that was too long, too sharp. Then it was gone, leaving only the scent of old bones and the sound of that terrible flute music. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran all the way back to my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The radio crackled to life as I drove, and for a moment I heard a voice I recognized. My grandfather's voice, speaking in Ojibwe about the guardians of the dead. When I got back to the ranger station, I found a message waiting for me. Tom Bellinger, one of the tribal elders, was coming to help with the investigation. He'd arrived that evening. I felt a surge of relief. Mayo would know what to do. He'd been my grandfather's friend, knew all the old stories better than anyone. If something supernatural was happening, he'd help me understand it. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that everything had a logical explanation. Heat exhaustion, maybe. Stress from the unusual weather. The mind could play terrible tricks when you were alone in the woods for too long. But when evening came and Tom didn't show up, I knew something was wrong. I drove out to where he'd said he'd meet me, and I found him sitting by the shore, perfectly still, staring out at the water. "Tom?" I called out. "Tom, are you all right?" He didn't answer. When I got closer, I saw why. Tom Bellinger was dead, but he'd been mummified somehow, his skin dried and preserved like ancient leather. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. In his lap was a single white eagle feather, and carved into the tree behind him were symbols I recognized from my grandfather's stories, warnings about disturbing the dead. The bone flute music started up again, closer this time, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was out there wasn't just taking people randomly. It was hunting everyone who came near the burial grounds. And I was next. I should have left then. Should have called for backup, sealed off the area, and let someone else deal with it. But I couldn't abandon the missing families, and something deeper was driving me forward. A need to understand what was happening to my grandfather's sacred places. Over the next 3 days, I found more bodies. All of them mummified, all of them wearing expressions of pure terror. But the strange thing was they were all perfectly preserved. No decay, no insects, like something had sucked all the moisture out of them in an instant. The bone flute music followed me everywhere now. It played my grad and father's death song, but also other melodies. Lullabies I remembered from childhood, hunting songs, morning wails, always from different directions, always just out of sight. My Equipment kept malfunctioning. The compass spun wildly. The radio picked up voices speaking in languages that had been dead for centuries, and my watch ran backward during the daylight hours. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night, I dreamed I was flying. Not like a bird, but like something skeletal and hollow, soaring over the forest with wings made of bone and shadow. In the dreams, I could see through the creature's eyes, and I was hunting. Hunting people who had disturbed the burial grounds, people who had forgotten the old ways. I saw construction crews who had built too close to sacred sites. I saw archaeologists who had dug where they shouldn't have. I saw tourists who had taken artifacts from the burial mounds, and I hunted them all, one by one, preserving their terror for eternity. The fourth night, I woke up screaming. But the worst part wasn't the nightmare. It was the taste of fear in my mouth, sweet and metallic, like I'd actually been feeding on it. That's when I decided to perform a protection ceremony. My grandfather had taught me bits and pieces of the old rituals, enough to maybe create a barrier between myself and whatever was out there. I gathered sage, tobacco, and sweetgrass, and prepared to spend the night at the burial mounds. If the baycock wanted me, it would have to come through the old protections. I arrived at sunset when the shadows were longest and the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The bone flute music was louder than ever, coming from all directions at once. I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness between the trees. I lit the sage and began the ceremony, speaking the words my grandfather had taught me in his careful, patient voice. The smoke rose in spirals, and for a moment I felt safe, protected. That's when it manifested. The baycock rose from the largest burial mound like smoke given form, 10 feet tall, all bone and shadow, with wings that stretched 20 feet from tip to tip. Its skull was elongated, predatory, and its eye sockets burned with cold fire. In its hands it held a flute carved from human bone. When it spoke, it used my grandfather's voice. "You have come to join the Guardians, Joseph. Your bones will sing beautiful songs." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't work. The creature's presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I could feel my moisture being drawn away, my skin starting to tighten and dry. "You see the truth now," it said, still in my grandfather's voice. "The burial grounds have been violated. The dead cry out for protection. You will help us guard what is sacred." Images flooded my mind. Visions of every person who had disturbed the burial sites over the past century. I saw their deaths, experienced their terror, felt their bones being stripped away while they were still alive. The baycock wasn't just a guardian. It was a collector, preserving the fear of those who had forgotten to respect the dead. "Your grandfather understood," the creature continued. "He sent you to us. Your mixed blood makes you perfect. You can walk between worlds, guard both the living and the dead." I felt my ribs starting to show through my skin, my bones becoming visible as the moisture left my body. But just as I was about to join the collection, something inside me rebelled, not against the creature, but against the idea of becoming like it. "No," I whispered. "There has to be another way." The baycock paused, its burning eyes studying me. "You would refuse your destiny?" "I would fulfill it differently." The creature's grip on me loosened slightly, and I felt moisture returning to my skin, but I knew I was still in deadly danger. The baycock had killed dozens of people, and I was just one more potential victim. "Tell me about the violite." "Lions," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Show me what happened." The creature raised its bone flute to its lips, and suddenly I was seeing through its eyes again. But this time, I wasn't hunting. I was witnessing. I saw construction crews from the 1960s, bulldozers tearing through burial mounds to build a resort. I saw archaeologists in the 1970s, digging up sacred remains and shipping them to museums. I saw tourists in the past few years taking pottery fragments and arrowheads as souvenirs. Each violation had awakened the baycock a little more, feeding its rage and power. The missing families weren't random victims. They were connected to the desecration. Eddie Kingbird's nephew had worked construction on the resort. Tom Bellinger had helped the archaeologists, thinking he was preserving his people's history. They forgot the old ways, the creature said, lowering its flute. They forgot that the dead must be protected, so we protect them ourselves. I understood now. The Baycock wasn't evil. It was desperate. It had been awakened by decades of violation and disrespect, and it was doing what it thought was necessary to protect the sacred places. But killing them won't solve anything, I said. More people will come. More violations will happen. The only way to truly protect the burial grounds is to make the living remember why they're sacred. The creature's burning eyes fixed on me. You would do this? You would make them remember? I would try. And if you fail? I looked around at the ancient burial mounds, at the sacred ground where my ancestors had been laid to rest. Then I'll join you. But let me try first. The Baycock was silent for a long moment. Then it began to change, its skeletal form becoming more human, more familiar. The burning eyes softened, and I saw something I recognized in its face, the same mixture of sadness and determination that my grandfather had worn in his final years. You are truly your grandfather's blood, it said. He came to us many years ago when the first violations began. He made the same offer you make now. My heart stopped. Grandfather? He became our voice among the living, our protector in the world of men. When he died, we waited for someone to take his place. We hoped it would be you. The creature reached out with one skeletal hand and touched my forehead. I felt a surge of knowledge, of understanding. I saw the true history of the burial grounds, the centuries of guardianship, the sacred trust that had been passed down through generations. The choice is yours, Joseph Whitehawk. Become our voice, and the killing stops. The dead will rest peacefully, and the living will remember their obligations. But if you fail, if the violations continue, we will have no choice but to expand our guardianship. I thought about Tom Bellinger, mummified by the shore, about Eddie Kingbird and his family, preserved in terror for eternity, about all the people who had died because they had forgotten to respect the dead. I accept, I said. The creature smiled, and for a moment, I saw my grandfather's face looking back at me. Then, let us begin your education. The transformation happened over the next 3 days. The Baycock taught me the true history of the burial grounds, showed me how to sense disturbances, how to communicate with the spirits of the dead. I learned to see the forest as it really was, not just trees and water, but a living repository of sacred memory. When I emerged from the burial mounds, I had aged 20 years. My hair had gone completely white, and my bones were visible beneath my skin like shadows. But I was still alive, still human, still capable of walking between worlds. The official report blamed the deaths on carbon monoxide poisoning from boat engines, a tragic accident during the wild rice harvest. The families were given proper burials and the investigation was closed. But I knew the truth. And more importantly, I knew my new responsibility. And I resigned from the Ranger Service and became a cultural liaison, working with tribal councils and government agencies to protect sacred sites. I spoke at schools, at community meetings, at academic conferences, always carrying the same message: respect the dead, protect the sacred places, remember the old ways. Most people listened. Some didn't. The ones who didn't learn found out about the Baycock firsthand. Construction projects that violated burial sites experienced mysterious equipment failures and worker disappearances. Archaeological digs that proceeded without proper spiritual protocols were abandoned after researchers began having nightmares about flying skeletons. Tourists who took artifacts from sacred sites found their way back to the burial grounds, no matter how far they traveled. I became the guardian between worlds, the voice that warned people before the Baycock had to act. It was a heavy burden, but a necessary one. Years passed. The wild rice beds recovered from the drought. New families came to harvest, respecting the old traditions, staying away from the burial grounds. The forest found its balance again. But every full moon, I feel my bones glowing beneath my skin, and I hear the bone flute music calling from the burial mounds. It's a reminder of what I am now. Not quite human, not quite spirit, but something in between. The baycock still flies through the forest at night, watching, waiting, protecting. But now it hunts with more precision, more purpose. It knows that some of the living will remember their obligations, will respect the sacred places and honor the dead. And it knows that I will help them remember. Last month, I found my own name carved into the stone of the largest burial mound. Not a threat, but a promise. When my time comes, I'll join the guardians permanently, adding my voice to the chorus of protectors that watch over the sacred places. Until then, I continue my work, walking between worlds, keeping the old stories alive. Because the dead deserve their rest, and the living need to remember why some places are cred. The forest is quiet now, but it's not empty. It's full of memories, full of spirits, full of guardians who will never let the sacred places be violated again. And if you're reading this, if you're planning to visit the burial grounds, remember one thing: show respect. Follow the old ways, honor the dead, because the baycock is still out there and it's still collecting bones. But it prefers to collect them from people who have forgotten how to respect the sacred. Don't be one of them.